Hey everyone, it's Mr. Stafford, and today we're going to talk about the road to the American Revolution. So, some events that are going to lead up to the drafting and signing of the American Declaration of Independence. Let's start with some historical context. It's always a great place to start. It's where we expect you to start in your essays. So, it's where I'm going to start right now. We're going to rewind a little bit. We're going to move back to the 1600s, the original founding of the colonies. And people were seeking wealth and opportunity as they came to the New World. And Great Britain sought wealth and opportunity from the colonies, and that was a system known as mercantilism, a philosophy that suggested that the ultimate purpose of the colonies was to enrich the mother country, in this case, Great Britain. And so we got to remember that that is the mindset that is driving Britain's colonial policies. So by 1651, Britain has decided that they're not making enough money off of the colonies, and so they need to better regulate trade and make sure that the business that's going on in the colonies is directly benefiting the mother country. And they do this with a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. And that kind of becomes the norm from the 1650s into the 1700s. All goods sent from the colonies have to go through England. All goods have to be transported on English ships. It actually leads to a war with the Dutch because the Dutch were very involved in trading in the New World. All right, so that's important context. Then in 1721, this fine-looking young man here by the name of Robert Walpole became the de facto prime minister of Great Britain, United Kingdom, and the Lord of Treasury. And he had a different idea. He thought, rather than ratcheting down and regulating trade, if the colonies are allowed to trade freely, then they will flourish, and we being Parliament, will reap the rewards of that with greater tax revenues. So he implemented a policy, or he's credited for implementing a policy of free trade known as salutary neglect, essentially leaving the colonies to their own devices. So this is what's really important. From 1721 to the 1750s, the colonies were not being closely monitored or tightly watched and taxed by the British government. They were largely left to their own devices. In fact, it was considered de facto independence, right? Which means not legal independence, but just they were treated as if they were independent. They were governing themselves. Okay, so let's fast forward now to the French and Indian War, which you learned about last week as a major turning point in the history between the American colonies and Great Britain. So at the start of this, as war was imminent, as wars breaking out in the colonies, Benjamin Franklin suggested a plan of union, an attempt to unify the colonies so that their response to the French and Indian threat would be unified. And it doesn't really pan out, but it's important because it starts to set those wheels in motion of unifying the colonies. All right. As you learned last week, the war was costly. And the question after the war that emerges is who should bear the cost of the war. Colonists would argue that they paid with their lives, but Parliament would argue that they paid with sterling pounds, right? They paid with money. They paid with resources. And those in Britain were paying much higher taxes than those in the colonies right now. So they thought, the colonists, they can bear to pay a little bit more than they are paying currently. They're paying less than most Englishmen. Most British subjects are paying more taxes than they are. They can bear to pay a little bit more in taxes. And so this is going to be what sets off a back and forth that really creates a lot of tension and disrupts the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. And this is why it's important to remember that salutary neglect is the period right before this, right? We're coming out of a period where there wasn't much involvement. Now Britain is asserting their authority and saying, okay, look, you got to play by our rules now. All right. This cartoon here is by Benjamin Franklin, and it was his attempt to illustrate the importance of being unified as colonies. And he does this when he is discussing the Albany Plan of Union. But this snake and this imagery will come back when we see the American Revolution taking shape in the 1770s. All right. At the end of the French and Indian War, as you learned, the colonists were prohibited from settling west of the Appalachians. And the king was attempting to appease Native Americans. Remember Pontiac's Rebellion that you read about or learned about in the lectures last week. And additionally, he wanted to secure a monopoly for the crown on future land acquisitions west of the Appalachian Mountains, right? That any negotiations would have to be done between the king and the Native Americans rather than individual colonists or the colonies securing that right and power for the king. Right? Colonists were upset about this. They had already settled there. They had plans to settle there. And they felt as though this was, again, the king and the British government infringing on their freedom and limiting their opportunities. So the proclamation line of 1763 does not go over well in the colonies. All right, and then we have the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. These are going to be taxes. These are new types of taxes, right? Smuggling had been the norm in the colonies during the period of salutary neglect. And so now the philosophy is we need to ratchet back. Walpole's idea is not working in a current context, so we need to start implementing taxes. And they do that by kind of re-upping the Navigation Acts and saying, look, we're going to start enforcing these things. The goal is to raise revenues, and this was a new thing for the colonists, right? Previously, Navigation Acts, remember, had been implemented to direct the economic benefits of trade to England. Now it's basically a direct tax on the colonists that money is going to go back to England. And that was not welcome by the colonists. They did it to themselves. Their colonial legislatures would implement direct taxes, but they were not keen on British Parliament doing that, right? The British argument is, hey, the colonists should be paying for their own colonial defense. We helped to defend them. They need to defer and defray that costs. The colonists saw this as a violation of their liberty, violation of their freedom. All right, it's going to be resistance, it's going to be organization. I'm going to talk in more detail about the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress, which leads to the Continental Congress, in a separate lecture. So more details on the Stamp Act in a separate lecture, so keep an eye out for that. Eventually, the Stamp Act is going to be repealed in 1766, but it is repealed with a law called the Declaratory Act, in which Britain says, you know what, we're repealing this Stamp Act, but we're retaining our right to tax you. That's within our right to do this. So we might be repealing it, right, to try and appease you and calm things down, but it's not because we don't have a right to do it. You've not won that argument. You've won this battle, but not the war, is essentially what Parliament is saying. All right, so moving forward to the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts are a series of taxes, again, in 1767, kind of on the heels of the Declaratory Act. They say, well, let's give it another try, right? And so they implement more taxes, this time on a variety of things. And the colonial response is much the same. No, we don't want to pay your taxes. And a farmer from Pennsylvania named John Dickinson writes some pamphlets where this phrase begins to emerge: no taxation without representation. And it begins to be the rally cry for those who are opposed to these new taxes. They say, look, we get it, taxes, okay, but you have representation. When you tax Englishmen in England, they vote for representatives that go to Parliament. There are no representatives from the colonies in Parliament, so we should not have taxes levied upon us. And this becomes the rally cry that you've probably heard before: no taxation without representation. The British response is, you have virtual representation, right? All of those members of Parliament know that the colonies are part of the United Kingdom, and they're recognizing your interests and your challenges, and they're considering you when they are passing laws. So you have virtual representation. You may not get to elect them, but they represent you. This, again, leads to unrest in the colonies. Most of this unrest is focused in New England, right? Okay, moving on to the Boston Massacre. In 1770, the British had sent 2,000 regulars. These are soldiers, British soldiers. They would have been called redcoats at the time. And this is a significant number because the population of Boston at the time was about 16,000. So we're sending a significant number of British regulars, redcoats, to Boston to try and maintain order. The conflicts are going to escalate. Think about today, right? We've got a lot of unrest in this country. There's protests going on in cities. There's some violence. It's getting kind of chaotic. And the presence of federal agents just a few weeks ago in Portland, what kind of impact did that have on the protests? Did they de-escalate? Did they escalate? Well, you can imagine as the redcoats, as the regulars are coming into Boston, it creates more tension. There's increased conflict, right? So by March of 1770, this boils over into a conflict that results in the killing of 5 colonists. So the British regulars kill 5 colonists. This becomes known as the Boston Massacre, and it really sets things off in New England. So in April, the Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts except for the Tea Act, right, which will be relevant because it becomes the much-loathed Tea Act that inspires the Tea Party. So in 1773, tensions still high in Boston. there is the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party, as you probably learned, is colonists kind of taking a whole shipment of tea and throwing it into the harbor. The British response, the coercive acts, known by the colonists as the intolerable acts. And these acts are meant to punish the colonists. Four main laws that were part of the coercive acts. One implemented a new government, said, okay, the king and parliament, we're going to appoint governors to rule over Boston because you guys are going crazy. They're going to close Boston Harbor to business. And they're going to say that British officials can be tried in other colonies or brought back to England for trials. And the colonists must provide quarter or housing for soldiers. And this puts the colonists over the top in Boston. So by 1775, we have the shot heard around the world. Mr. McCarty is going to do a great lecture on the fighting of the Revolutionary War, and he's going to talk more about that. But there's fighting, and that leads to the development of a Second Continental Congress. Go check out my Stamp Act lecture. We'll talk more about the Continental Congress as a result of the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress. These are some of the things the Continental Congress is going to do. They're going to name George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. They're going to draft and sign the Declaration of Independence. They're going to manage the war effort, and they're going to write and approve the Articles of Confederation, which is basically our first constitution. All right, so that leads us to the Declaration of Independence, right? In July of 1776, the Declaration of Independence is written and signed. Fighting is well underway at this point, so we need to look at the purposes of the Declaration of Independence as justifying the revolution and uniting the colonies. Okay, we're going to talk more about the Declaration of Independence in class. You're going to do a discussion this week that is going to investigate and evaluate the motivations for the Declaration of Independence. You're going to look at two interpretations. One by Howard Zinn that says the motivations were largely selfish. One by Bernard Bailyn who says they're largely ideological. So this week you're going to get to decide, and we will share out in seminar in class. All right, so that's a quick lead up to the war. Be sure you ask any questions that you have when you come to class. All right, take care.